Hi guy, welcome back TV spoilers. Do you think Matt can escape legal consequences after causing the accident that killed Nick? What is he planning to do next? Sharon could barely hear the rest of the world the moment the news about Nick hit. It didn't arrive like a single update, it landed like a cold blade slicing straight through the fragile calm she'd been forcing herself to wear. One short sentence about an accident was enough to make everything inside her collapse. Because Sharon knew Nick wasn't the kind of man who stumbled into danger without a real, brutal reason. And then that reason sharpened into something cruelly clear. Nick had confronted Matt Clark on his own. The fact both terrified and infuriated her at once. Part of her understood the instinct that always drove Nick forward. The same instinct that made him protect first and process later. But another part of her felt the panic spread like poison. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be talked down or a fight that ended when someone walked away. Matt was the kind of threat that knew how to wait, how to pretend, how to choose the perfect second to strike. He didn't need chaos, he created it with precision. The details Sharon managed to gather tightened around her ribs until breathing felt like a choice. She might lose. Nick had handled the confrontation at least at first. But Matt got away. Those 3 words got away were enough to set off a chain reaction in Sharon's head. A row of falling dominoes she couldn't stop. Matt wouldn't disappear quietly. He would retaliate. And that was exactly what he did. He attacked Nick while Nick was driving, turning the simplest act, keeping a car on the road, into a nightmare built on seconds. Sharon pictured it in jagged flashes, the sudden movement, the wheel jerking, the road narrowing into a tunnel. Nick forced to choose between staying upright and fighting back against someone determined to kill him in the one moment. He couldn't defend himself. No one in the Newman family said the words out loud, but Sharon could feel the waiting like a verdict hovering above them. It sat in their rigid faces, in the stretched silences, in the way everyone clung to each new scrap of information as if one hopeful detail might grant permission to breathe again. Sharon couldn't. She couldn't soothe herself with the easy lie that Nick would walk away from this with bruises and a story. Car accidents didn't just break bones, they broke futures. And Sharon's fear wasn't the dramatic kind that exploded and burned out, it was the relentless kind that tightened by the minute, a slow constriction that made her feel as if letting go of anything, even for a second, would send Nick slipping out of reach forever. And then there was Matt. The question people whispered, would the police catch the driver, landed in Sharon's ears like helplessness disguised as hope. Because with men like Matt, caught was always a race against time and cunning. And justice usually arrived late, after the damage had already become permanent. Sharon knew Matt would run fast. He wasn't arrogant enough to stick around and prove he was innocent. He had only survival instincts and a cold talent for erasing himself. Worse, Sharon couldn't stop thinking he wouldn't run alone. If he was smart, and Matt always was when it mattered, and had aimed for a way out of the country. And the name Annie surfaced like a splinter Sharon couldn't pull free. If Matt could escape overseas with Annie, it meant he still had options, still had control, still had a path forward. Meanwhile, Nick had been reduced to a body on a gurney and a heartbeat on a monitor. When Sharon heard the words emergency surgery, she felt something inside her go hollow. Emergency meant there was no buffer time, no chance to prepare, no space to bargain with reality. It meant there were things she had always believed she would say later. Only now later might not exist. She was dragged into a version of life where events moved too fast. Choices were made without consent. And a single door closing an operating room door split the world into before and after. Sharon understood, with a clarity that hurt, that Nick didn't just need a successful procedure. He needed time. And time was the one thing none of them could manufacture. But the real shock came when the doctors found a rare cardiac complication during surgery. Rare sounded clinical, almost distant, until Sharon realized what it truly meant: higher risk, fewer answers, a treatment plan that couldn't be improvised. The complication required a special blood type, or a specific organ match, something unusually hard to locate quickly. Sharon felt time turn predatory. Every minute became a threat. She watched the urgency in the medical team like a pressure she couldn't see, but could feel in her skin. And then the sentence that changed everything landed like a punch. Only one member of the Newman family was a viable match. In that instant, Sharon understood this wasn't just a medical crisis. It was a moral trap. Because the person who could save Nick was someone Sharon had a deep, complicated history with, Samin, tied to old fractures, old betrayals. The kind of wounds she had survived by building boundaries strong enough to keep her upright. And when the possibility of Adam formed in her mind, it wasn't just discomfort. It was dread. Sharon didn't need anyone to remind her why Adam could never be a simple solution. Their conflict wasn't a single argument, it was years of tension, distrust, and the exhausting knowledge that every good action could come with strings attached. Adam agreed to donate. For a split second, Sharon should have felt relief. Instead, she felt her stomach drop because the agreement didn't arrive as a gift. It arrived with a condition. Adam wanted a major sacrifice from Sharon in exchange. The demand turned a life-saving act into a transaction. And Sharon hated how instantly it exposed her weakest place. In the moment Nick's life teetered on a knife edge, Sharon wasn't the composed woman who could control a room. She was simply someone terrified of losing him. And a damn complicated, sharp, and painfully perceptive had found that fear and wrapped his fingers around it. Sharon didn't even need the conditions spelled out in detail for it to feel dangerous. The danger wasn't only in what Adam wanted, it was in the imbalance of power. Adam could choose to give Nick a chance or take it away based on what Sharon agreed to surrender. Sharon's anger flared, then faltered, then returned as something heavier, a kind of grief for the fact that Nick's survival could become leverage in anyone's hands. She didn't want to paint Adam as a villain in a story that was already too brutal, because Sharon knew life rarely offered clean categories like good and evil. But she also refused to be naive. A demand made in the middle of life or death didn't feel like generosity. It felt like control. The smallest updates from the operating room became needles in Sharon's nerves. She watched everyone around her orbit the same point closed door. The clock and the ticking inside her head grew louder than the hospital itself. She asked herself if there was any other option if she refused Adam's terms. And she hated how quickly the answer seemed to form. Probably not in time. She also asked herself what she would lose if she agreed. A major sacrifice was never just one moment. It was a shift in the relationship's balance. A future shaped by a debt that could be called in again and again. Sharon was terrified that even if Nick lived, she would no longer recognize the life that followed. She would become the woman who traded away part of herself to keep him breathing. And that trade might haunt her long after the crisis ended. She couldn't stop thinking about how Nick had chosen to face Matt alone. Sharon understood that choice. It was Nick being Nick, but understanding didn't soften the pain. The what-ifs pressed in. What if Nick had called for backup? What if he'd been more cautious? What if Matt hadn't attacked while he was driving? Sharon cut those thoughts off before they turned into blame. Because she knew regret couldn't rewind time. It could only poison the seconds she still had. And outside this waiting room, Matt might already be vanishing. Sharon pictured him on the move, mapping out an escape route, calculating flights, dragging Annie along either as a shield or a partner. The contrast was unbearable. Matt still had choices, still had freedom, still had motion. Sharon had none. She had only a decision that needed to be made now before the operating room delivered its final, irreversible outcome. Sharon tried to convince herself that Adam was still part of the Newman family, that in extreme moments people could rise above old grudges. But the distrust in her was too old to silence easily. Adam had agreed to help, yet he demanded a sacrifice. Was he saving Nick out of family loyalty? Or saving Nick to force Sharon into something she would never choose freely? Sharon's mind kept circling the same truth. There was no safe answer. Only pain and more pain. The hospital air felt thick, like a fog made of tension and helplessness. Sharon stared at the closed door as if sheer willpower could reach through steel and glass and find Nick wherever he was on that table. She wanted him to know she was there, that she was fighting in the only way she could have, even though this fight had no steering wheel, no obvious enemy in front of her, only an ultimatum waiting to swallow her whole. And just as Sharon thought she might be able to do anything to save Nick, the cruel edge of Adam's demand came into focus. This major sacrifice wasn't something she could dismiss, or promise casually, or forget once the crisis passed. It was something that would change her. If she accepted, she might save Nick, but she would also open a door for Adam to step back into her life, with a kind of power he had never possessed before. If she refused, she might protect her boundaries, but she could lose Nick. And that loss would become a wound that never closed. Sharon stood there, suspended between two futures. While somewhere beyond reach, Matt might already be running, already rewriting his own fate. And in the most terrifying twist of all, Sharon realized her decision, whichever way she went, would begin its consequences immediately. She just didn't know if the choice she made would save Nick or destroy the rest of her life. In a way even more ruthless than the crash itself, Sharon entered the hospital like someone yanked out of reality. Everything around her was moving, voices rising and falling, footsteps rushing past. Faces tightened with urgency, but Sharon felt suspended in a cold, hollow space where only one truth had weight: Nick was in surgery. After the crash, connected to Matt Clark. Every update she received carried the same terrifying tone, urgent, sharp, and with no room for easy comfort. Sharon didn't need anyone to remind her that Nick had survived too much in his life to be taken down by an ordinary collision. But this wasn't ordinary. This was calculated. This was a forced disaster. And the thought that Nick had been pushed into danger not by fate but by someone's intent made Sharon feel sick with helpless rage. At first, Sharon tried to keep herself upright with the simplest thoughts: Nick would make it. The doctors would handle it, this would end. But that thin belief didn't last. When the operating room doors closed behind Nick, Sharon understood how brutal waiting could be. It wasn't like waiting for a late call or a delayed care, it was like being forced to listen to a clock pounding inside your chest, one beat at a time. Each beat potentially the last heartbeat of the person you couldn't afford to lose. She looked around and saw the Newman family trapped in the same suspended nightmare. Only each of them wore their fear differently, some with stiff control, some with brittle silence. Sharon didn't have the strength to pretend she was fine. She couldn't perform stability when her entire body was screaming that something irreversible was happening behind that door. Then the news changed everything with the speed of a blow. The doctors discovered a rare cardiac complication during the emergency procedure. The phrase rare complication sounded clinical, almost distant, until Sharon realized what it truly meant: uncertainty, higher risk, fewer options, and a problem no one could solve on instinct alone. She heard them explain that saving Nick would require a special blood type, or a specific organ match, something unusually rare, something that couldn't be found quickly without luck. Sharon felt the floor beneath her turn to sand. The crash had been horrifying enough, but now there was an additional threat. An unforeseen door opening straight onto the worst possibilities. Sharon's panic wasn't loud. It was the kind that turned her silent because fear stole language. She tried to cling to every term, every explanation, forcing herself to understand what needed really meant, how rare was, how much time Nick had left. But there were moments when knowledge didn't help, because the more she understood, the more powerless she became. She stared at the operating room doors as if sheer will could pull Nick back from the edge. But all she could do was wait and receive more information that made breathing harder. When the doctor said there was only one suitable donor, Sharon wanted to believe it was hope finally breaking through. But that hope became a blade the moment she heard the rest. The match was a member of the Newman family, and worse, someone Sharon had a deep, painful history with. In an instant, Sharon realized Nick's life had been tied to an old, thorned thread, past wounds that never truly vanished, only dulled beneath time and forced endurance. She didn't need the name spoken aloud. In her mind, Adam's name rose like an unavoidable verdict. Adam wasn't just family, he was complication, history, and a collection of memories Sharon couldn't touch without bleeding. To save Nick, Sharon would have to go to Adam. And with that realization came a bitter truth: sometimes life doesn't just demand courage, it demands you walk back into the very place you swore would never control you again. Sharon found Adam in a state she never wanted anyone to witness. No armor, no practiced composure, no pride, only a raw Sharon stripped down by terror, carrying a plea that wasn't for herself but for Nick. She knew every second mattered, that the window to save Nick could narrow with each minute. She also knew that if Adam refused, there likely wouldn't be another option in time. That dependence made Sharon both frightened and furious. Matt Clark could put Nick on an operating table, but Adam could determine whether Nick had a chance to come off it alive. Sharon hated that Nick's life could be placed in someone else's hands this way. Adam agreed to donate, and for one brief moment Sharon thought she could finally exhale. But then the condition arrived. Adam didn't offer salvation as a gift, turned it into a deal. He demanded a major personal sacrifice from Sharon in exchange for saving Nick. Sharon's relief collapsed into shock. Because once a life-saving act becomes a transaction, it stops being only medical. It becomes leverage. It becomes proof that at Sharon's weakest moment, Adam could push her to surrender something she would never give freely. And Sharon would have to consider it. Because Nick didn't have time for principles that cost minutes. That confrontation wasn't only Sharon versus Adam, it was Sharon versus herself. Sharon wanted to scream that this was wrong, that Nick wasn't a bargaining chip, that no one had the right to attach conditions to someone else's survival. But she also knew time didn't care about fairness. She was standing at a crossroads where both paths were cruel: protect her boundaries, and possibly lose Nick, or save Nick by giving up something that could permanently change her life. Sharon felt forced to choose between two kinds of pain, and neither came with a clean ending. In Sharon's mind, Nick on that table outweighed her pride. Every time she thought she could accept anything, fear snapped back, because she understood the consequences of a sacrifice made in desperation. If she agreed, Sharon would live under Adam's shadow in a way she might never escape, and the balance between them could shift forever. Sharon had worked too hard to build a life where she wasn't pulled into old spirals. Now, simply because Nick needed saving, she was being dragged back not by emotion, but by a contract she couldn't step away from. Her inner battle grew vicious. Logic kept repeating the facts: Adam was the only match, Nick needed help now. This deal might be the only price that could buy Nick's next heartbeat. But another voice colder, sharper, warned her that a price paid in panic rarely ends at the first demand. Sharon feared Adam wouldn't ask once and stop. She feared this would become an open door for more claims, more control, more conditions. Until Sharon no longer recognized the life she'd fought to rebuild. While Sharon wrestled with the impossible, the Newman family couldn't stay untouched. The truth about the rare complication and the deal spread like a crack racing through a wall, already lined with fractures. Their shock wasn't only about Nick's condition, it was about the idea that his life could be negotiated. The pressure on Sharon intensified even without anyone speaking. Some would silently believe she had to do whatever it took because it was Nick. Others would fear she was handing Adam too much power. Some would judge Adam for turning donation into leverage. And some, in their own panic, might blame Sharon if she hesitated for even a second, because they couldn't bear the thought of losing Nick over a delay. The division wasn't loud, but it was heavy. It made Sharon feel like she wasn't only carrying Nick's fetish, was carrying a family's fear, expectations, and quiet resentments too. Sharon realized she was being crushed by two fears at once, the fear of Nick dying, and the fear of Nick living while her own life shattered in another way. She had never felt life so fragile. One rare complication was enough to flip everything, to turn strong people into desperate ones begging time to slow down. Sharon thought of all the years she'd spent learning to stand again, learning to survive, to protect herself, to refuse control. And now that lesson was being tested in the cruelest form, to save someone else. Would she accept being controlled again? In the end, Sharon understood she couldn't remain suspended. Nick didn't have time for her hesitation. These weren't minutes on a clock, they were the distance between one heartbeat and the next. Sharon made the painful choice and accepted the sacrifice, bound to a damn it. Because she believed it was fair, but because Nick couldn't die while a door, even a thorned one, still existed. And that moment of acceptance didn't feel like victory. It felt like Sharon had signed something she could never undo. As if she had placed a stone on her own chest and promised herself she would learn to breathe under its weight. When the family learned Sharon had agreed, the air in the hospital didn't become lighter. It simply shifted into a different kind of tension, the tension of the price that would be paid. Nick was still in surgery. Adam would still do his part. And Sharon, standing there as the person who had preserved hope, felt herself stepping into a future with no map. She didn't know what condition Nick would wake in. She didn't know whether the Newman family would unite or fracture after this. And she didn't know what Adam would do with the sacrifice once the immediate crisis ended. And in the moment Sharon thought the decision was finally done, she realized the most terrifying truth of all: saving Nick was only the beginning. Once Nick survived, people would ask what Sharon had given up. And when the answer surfaced, Sharon might discover that her deal with Adam wasn't the end of the nightmare. It was the opening move of a new, quieter war. One that could destroy her from the inside, just as Nick opened his eyes and believed the worst was finally over. On our TV Spoilers channel, I'm always looking for content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting insights. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.